So, hello everyone. Good morning in Canada and other parts in North America. Good afternoon in Europe and Africa, and good evening in other more eastern parts of the world. Welcome to this webinar organized by Metropolis International. I'm not sure that each of you is familiar with Metropolis International, so let me just say a few words. The organization has existed since 1996, and it was built up as an institution that discusses matters related to migration, to diversity, to integration, and so on and so forth. And the basic idea is that we connect different constituencies. So we connect academic researchers, policymakers, people from civic society organizations, or the business community. And we've done that all the time in various ways. Normally we have an annual conference, but due to the pandemic that is still going on in many parts of the world, we've decided to postpone it. But next year there will be one in Berlin, September. And for the time being, we fill the gap with a series of seminars, of webinars, and this one is one of them. To be sure, we are in the process of launching a new website. I will share the website in the chat box. It's a beta version, so it's not officially, but at least you get an idea of what we are, what we want to do, and how we work, and who is involved. My name is Jan Raats. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm also one of the two chairs of Metropolis International. And I will immediately give the floor to Howard Duncan, who was the previous chair of Metropolis International, and who will moderate this webinar. Howard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan. It's good to be here. And let me begin by thanking you and thanking Metropolis for hosting this session. We have titled the session, How Architecture and Urban Plans Matter to Immigrant and Refugee Integration. But we preface the title with the words, a neglected discussion. And people who are young, younger than me for sure, might actually regard this as a neglected discussion. People who are older, like I'll just mention myself, I won't point any other fingers, might remember that 25 or 30 years ago, this was a discussion that took place fairly regularly. And a number of social scientists were looking at the impact of the built environment on societies and social well-being. But of course, the academy and the policy community follows fashions, and fashions change, interests ebb and flow. And over the last couple of decades, the interest in the built environment has taken a little bit of a back seat to other issues, and these days most prominently reflected under the title of social justice. So what we would like to do today, even because we know that people are doing very important, in my view, very exciting work on the impact of the built environment on the well-being of refugees and immigrants, we wanted to raise this issue, perhaps in the hope that we can start to shift the fashion terrain in the academy and in the policy world back in this direction a little bit. So we're hoping that we can motivate more discussions, perhaps motivate more research. And I will not say any more about it. I'll leave it to our speakers to raise the level of interest in this, which I know that they will do. We have three speakers today who are in their own ways very impressive. They bring not only a combination of social science to our table, but a professional work as well. So 2 architects and 1 urban planner. So what I will do now is introduce all 3 of them, and then I will turn the floor over to our first speaker, who is Dr. Faten Kakano, who is a researcher in an organization in Montreal called CERCE, which looks at social innovation, aiming for equality and social justice in Quebec and Canada at large. She's also an associate researcher in the Laboratoire de Recherche Géographicité, where she studies land transformation in the Global South. Faten holds a PhD from the Faculty of Environmental Studies at the University of Montreal. Following 20 years of experience as a practitioner in architecture and design and an instructor in universities in Lebanon, she has oriented her career towards research with regard to refugee spaces. And in this connection, she studies the appropriation of refugee spaces based on a transdisciplinary approach, revealing the political, socioeconomic, legal, and humanitarian issues that influence refugees' living environments. Presently, she's leading 3 projects related to homelessness in Montreal, space appropriation in Indigenous territories, and the living spaces of temporary migrant workers in Canada. Following Faten, we will have Martina Bovo, who is an architect and a PhD student in urban planning, design, and policy at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies at the Politecnico di Milano. She is developing a research interest in the relationship between migration and territory, with particular attention to the dynamics related to first arrival and a look at spaces and policies. She collaborates in teaching and research activities on urban and welfare policies and ethnographic approaches to urban analysis. She has published and presented her work in Italy and abroad. And our last speaker will be Dr. Jixi Zhuang, who is a registered professional planner and an associate professor at Ryerson University's School of Urban and Regional Planning in Toronto. Her research focuses on ethnocultural diversity, migration in cities, and ethnic entrepreneurship and placemaking. Specifically, Dr. Zhuang explores the lived experiences of immigrant and racialized communities, their strategies for cultural recognition, and negotiations for social, economic, and political inclusion. Her research addresses the impacts of global migration on municipal policy and governance, and sheds light on equity-based approaches to planning with diversity. So these are our 3 speakers, and I'm very excited to hear their presentations. These webinars are very compact events, and we have therefore put perhaps undue or unfair pressure on our speakers to keep their remarks down to 12 to 14 minutes. I'll be keeping my eye on the clock, and I will waste no more time and turn the floor over to Faten Kakano. Faten, over to you, please.
Thank you, Howard, for the kind introduction. I will now share my screen. Are you able to see my presentation?
Yes, looks good.
According to Report, living spaces have 2 functions: a passive function, sheltering, and an active function, which is a social space marked by the identity and the culture of its inhabitants and best suited for their way of life. The main objective of this presentation is understanding the relation of refugees and migrants to space before their resettlement. It aims at answering the following questions. First, what is the relation between refugees and their so-called temporary living environments? Second, do refugees perceive their spaces as transitory solutions Are they a dehumanizing process, as described by many researchers, such as Agamben, or do they become home, a territorialized place of belonging, identity, and culture? And finally, assuming that some refugee spaces become home, how and why refugees transform these spaces? I will try to answer these questions based on a number of case studies of Syrian refugee spaces in Lebanon and Jordan. I will start by the case of Al-Zatari organized camp in Jordan. The picture on the top shows the Zatari during or at its creation in 2012. I had the chance to visit Al-Zatari in 2015, and the picture below shows what the Zatari has become. So how refugees transform this modular, linear, impersonal architecture into something that is very similar to a Syrian town. The picture shows Al-Sham Zélizé, Sham for Damascus, and it's the shopping street, the main shopping street in the camp that refugees named and appropriated. And one can find in this shopping street anything that starts from the falafel sandwich to a bridal shop. Space appropriation in the Zatari camp was not only on the level, on the urban level or at the level of the space in general, but also it targeted housing units. What refugees did was to create structures, metallic structures with car tires to be able to move their heavy caravans. They did that for two reasons. The first one is to recreate the multi-family living style of Syrians, because Syrians, and especially in rural areas, in large families, share a single home. And the second reason was the reproduction, consciously or unconsciously, of architectural forms of the place of origin. So this picture shows the home of three cousins who moved their three caravans and created a courtyard house and covered the courtyard with the tent that they received before they were allocated caravans. And this is a picture of courtyard Syrian traditional houses, and the link, I believe, is obvious. Syrian refugees appropriated the space in the Zatari camp for cultural reasons and for their well-being, but also it was a form of denial, resistance, and rejection of their spatial and social segregation. Because despite the fact that the camp from the inside looked like a town, it was still an open-air prison far from cities. They were able to do that because of the relative flexibility of the caravans, because of the availability of materials in a village close to the camp, because they had less restriction on their movement at the beginning of their asylum. And third, because they formed a community. Most of them came from the same Syrian localities, and they formed a community that is characterized by solidarity. But these are not the only conditions that allow refugees to appropriate space. We see here a picture of an informal settlement in the town of Kabylias in the Bekaa. Here too, housing units are flexible. Here too, refugees enjoy freedom of movement, and they more or less form a community. However, the socio-economic disparity inside the same settlement shows a very significant difference in space appropriation. This is the shelter of an elderly couple, and this is the reception tent or the madafi of the shawish or the manager of the camp. And the difference between both shelters, the first one, precarious, temporary, really used as a shelter, and the second one, marked by the identity of the owner, shows that space appropriation is really linked to economic resources. And it also arises the questions about temporary spaces. Are refugee spaces really temporary, or is this linked to their socioeconomic status? In the same settlement, we can see examples of space adaptation for daily needs. On the right, there is a water well, on the left, and on the right, there's a fire pit for laundry and cooking. We move now to our third case study, Al-Awda organized camp in the town of Bar Ilyas in the Bekaa, in Lebanon. The man in the picture on the right is Al-Mukhtar, or the mayor. This is how everybody addresses him, because in his village in Syria, he used to be a mayor. And what the Mukhtar did in the organized camp was mark the public space, every public space, with one of these stone sculptures that he did with his own hands. And when I asked him, Mukhtar, why do you do this? Why do you spend so much time and energy on doing these sculptures? His answer was to feel alive. My assumption was that the Mukhtar appropriated the public space of the camp as a replacement for the authority that he lost by being forcibly displaced from his town. In the same camp, I met families who had hardly enough money to put food on their table, but who grew birds. And the answer was to feel alive, to feel happy for the children. So through these appropriation, they wanted to create a sense of normality in their exceptional situation. The fourth case is the case of the informal settlement in Dalhamieh, also in the Bekaa in Lebanon. I entitled this slide Power, Culture, and Space because these three notions characterize the residents. They are powerful because most of them are legal settlers with residency permit. Most of them have significant economic resources, of course, if compared to others. And they have the same cultural background because they come from the same city of Idlib. As for the space, it is flexible. The housing units are flexible, and there is space around them in case refugees needed to develop them. In fact, the plan on the right shows the single-spaced shelter and the latrine that was given by the UNHCR when the camp or when the settlement was first created. The plan on the left shows how the space has been appropriated and developed and became similar to any modest rural home. These are pictures that show the interior of most spaces and the contrast between the internal spaces and the external appearance of the settlement from outside can be explained by three things. Refugees want to hide their relative economic comfort because they don't want to attract attention. Refugees have limited material to use due to restrictions imposed by the government, or it's also a conscious or unconscious reproduction of the Islamic architecture that is very modest from outside in homes and very rich from inside. The traditional coffee set, and something that I have seen in this settlement, in almost every shelter in the kitchen, women prepared moune or winter reserve nicely set on shelves for the winter. I go back to the Al-Awda organized camp to make a small comparison between shelters that are flexible and shelters that are less flexible. And here, the caravans are much more expensive than the housing units in Dalhamiye, and they are less flexible. And this lack of flexibility created a limitation for refugees' appropriation. The first picture was taken, the picture on the left, in 2014 at the creation of the camp. The picture of on the right, I was able to take it 6 months later, and there's a very important space appropriation, very fast one, and it's obvious, but it was not satisfying for refugees. All they were able to do was add a space. The pink space is the space that is added, either in front of their single single shelter, or at the back. And in both cases, refugees were not happy with the outcome. Despite the importance of the typology of space, what really matters regarding space appropriation is the power and control of refugees over their spaces. And this is very clear in the case of Al-Naba, an urban neighborhood close to Beirut. 75% of inhabitants are Syrian refugees, but despite the concentration of refugees, despite the fact that they live in Naba because they are able to find housing and jobs in the informal market, refugees in Naba do not or hardly appropriate their spaces. The reason is the owners are Shia with an allegiance to the powerful Hezbollah, and they control the neighborhood. They impose their conditions, and Syrian refugees feel that they are in a very vulnerable situation. They are often subject to exploitation, abuse, evictions, hostility, and violence. They live there because the municipality and the government cannot impose restrictions on their illegal situation, but they definitely pay the price. And these are a few examples of spaces, of interior spaces in Naba. This is the shop of Muhammad. On the picture, in the picture on the right, all what Muhammad did was to construct a metallic structure for his bed. This is another typology of space in Naba, lightweight structures on rooftops. But the main typology is apartments and rooms that are rented informally by many Syrian families. In this slide, I present to you patterns that I found, common patterns that I found in most refugee spaces in Lebanon and Jordan, showing the link to the place of origin. The Monet, or the winter reserve, religious symbols, carpets on the floor, tapestries and curtains covering walls and ceilings, plants, and finally hospitality, symbols of the Syrian hospitality. And I conclude with this slide in which I can confirm the very strong relation between space appropriation and power in refugee spaces. This relation exists anywhere, and in any situation, space appropriation and power are linked, but it's emphasized by the fact that refugees do not have any right to space. And power derives first from the perception of refugees by host communities, and second, by hosting policies that are adopted by the host states and that define the level of refugees' inclusion and of refugees' empowerment. I think that these results can be also found in countries where refugees resettle, but of course at different levels, given the fact that when they resettle, their situation is legal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faten. Fascinating presentation indeed. Just one thing I will ask you to talk about later on is, so thinking about the relationship between space appropriation and power, how does this manifest in decisions about architectural design, about what sorts of appropriations are permitted and which sorts are not permitted? So thank you very much. Martina, please, over to you now.
Thank you. I will also share my screen. Okay, so thanks for this invitation. I must say I'm very honored to be presenting in between the two other speakers. And yeah, I will be talking about the process of arrival and how much space and the way it is designed and organized matter in this process of arrival. And I wanted to start with this place, with this picture. That was the very first thing that came to my mind when I thought about this topic. This is the police office, police immigration office in Palermo in southern Italy. And this picture was taken on a Sunday, but in every other working day of the week, newcomers spend here a lot of hours outside this gate, waiting for an appointment or for information about their documents. And I think that this picture shows already very well how space and the way it is designed and organized matter in the experience of arrival and in the experience of integration. People here need to wait, there is no place to sit, and probably the only supportive element is the shadow that in any case goes away towards midday. So just having this initial picture in mind, I will focus, as I'm doing in my research, on the arrival process. And as I mentioned, the main argument is that there are certain space, in my case, urban spaces, and that really matter in this arrival process. And of course, here I'm intending arrival as the very first step towards integration. In my research, and also in the presentation, I will mainly referred to Mediterranean migration processes and the so-called central Mediterranean route. So basically the one that reaches Europe towards through southern Italy. Here I marked Palermo, this city in Sicily, where I conducted a short fieldwork last summer. And I will also refer to other cities in northern Italy and in Europe in general. To do this, the very first thing I wanted to say is that when we talk about arrival, we should take into account that in a process where migrations are becoming more and more diversified, at least in the Mediterranean case, also arrival is becoming more and more complex. So basically, we should not more refer to arrival as a moment, in a way, as a precise moment in a certain time and space, but rather as a complex process. And this is why I will refer to this term landing instead of arrival, that in a way, in our imaginary, is much linked to the moment and the space where a person arrives. And when I say that landing is a complex process, I mean that it implies a complex experience of temporal experience. So if we think that arrival does not imply in many cases a further settlement, but in many cases it is open to further transit. And also when people arrive, in most cases they will not be sedentary, but they will keep moving in a way. And Italy in this sense is a very clear example, because most of the people who arrived in Italy kept moving towards Northern Europe. And also profiles, of course, in the recent migration processes were really, really different. And of course, according to these different profiles, the way people would use space and their competencies of use of space were very different. And so when I refer to landing, what I want to stress is that it implies a very open-ended condition. So basically, what about these landing spaces? To explain this, I would move a little bit from a well-known framework of arrival neighborhoods or arrival city. And I would rather refer to landing spaces as all those spaces with which migrants get entangled upon arrival. So basically, wherever arrival or landing takes place. And so in the case of Palermo, this would firstly be the harbor, for instance, but in the case of other other Italian or European cities, these would be train station or bus stations. Of course, also reception facilities that popped up in overall Europe in the last years, and also other ordinary spaces. This is the case of a public library, and it has been proved that all over Europe, these places have had a huge role, a reference also for newcomers. And of course, also health clinics and so-called ethnic shops and public spaces. So when it comes to the question, why do these spaces matter, I think there is a first thing to say, that is that these spaces are not only ad hoc structures, so not only exceptional structures, but are also very ordinary parts of our cities and very ordinary objects of architecture and urban planning, if we think of public spaces or libraries, that for a certain time and for certain reason play a role also for newcomers. And so I think that when we ask ourselves why do they matter and how shall we address these spaces, there are at least three interesting issues that I assume are interesting both because they are very relevant to support this arrival and open-ended condition of newcomers, but also because they raise huge challenges for urban planning and architecture. And so the first point is the binary between what is temporary and what is permanent. So Faten has already mentioned this. In Europe, we have seen that the main answer from architecture and urban planning to these so-called temporary populations of refugees and asylum seekers were provisional structures like reception centers. And instead, there are a lot of experience that tell us that we should work a little bit more in between these binary and think that also structural answer and also permanent structure should be thought for so-called temporary needs. And in the background of this slide, there is a project of Belgian architecture collective that worked in this sense in the topic of housing typologies. So what is ordinary housing typologies and permanent housing also for asylum seekers and refugees. A second point is another binary, which is very important, I believe, for architecture and urban planning, which is this binary between mobile and sedentary. So if we think of these disciplines, they are very much based on sedentariness, so on something that is permanent and that does not move in a way. And this was true more generally for Europe towards asylum seekers and refugees. There was a whole debate in Europe about so-called trans migrants. So the idea that we should grant the access to basic services, but I would add also basic rights, only to those people that were proving to be willing to stay in that country. And of course, this is not possible if we go again to that concept of arrival that is very open-ended. So I don't know what is going to happen next. And in this picture, there is drawn a very interesting initiative of a mayor in the French town of Grand-Sainte, where basically there was this informal settlement growing of people that were stopping there, only waiting to cross the border with the UK. And against the will of the central government, this mayor decided to invest money on this settlement and to better off as much as he could the condition of this settlement by building wooden structures. And I think that this is an interesting example to think of how, despite he was targeting a population that was willing to move on, in any case, he chose to sort of invest on a more permanent and condition and sort of bettering off that settlement. And so I think this is a good sort of example to think about how to work in this binary between mobile and sedentary. And finally, the last point is again a tension between the diversity of profiles of newcomers and versus the very fixed regulatory categories that we use in urban planning. This is a very clear example that is not only true for arrival, but I guess also for settled immigrants. We know that so-called ethnic shop have a lot of functions for newcomers. So not only the commercial functions, but they also places for networking and to get information. And instead, if we think, for instance, of the regulations on the opening hours, in a way they prevent these shops to deploy all the functions they could have. And in this sense, here again, the question is, are we able to, as architects and urban planners, to sort of interpret these regulatory frameworks in a much looser way so that all these different uses can be actually deployed? And what I want to underline about these 3 points that I raised is that they really can range from spatial organization, so from very material and architectural matter to more immaterial matter as the one that urban planning deals with, so with regulations and norms and these kind of frameworks. And so I will. The last example I wanted to bring is this space in Palermo, again in southern Italy. I am very attached to. This is the space on the ground floor, the one with the red sign on the top of the door, and this is the space of an association that offers very general support and legal support, especially to irregular migrants that stay in Palermo without having any documents. And I think that here there is a little bit of these 3 issues that I raised, and they are a little bit concentrated in this space. In the first place, despite these people are targeting migrants that only stay in Palermo for a few days or for just few weeks, in any case, they are always open. So they try to stay open every day. And this was also a huge challenge during the pandemic. In this way, they really managed to be a reference also for people that only pass through Palermo. And so here again, I think there is an example of a structural and sort of continuous answer to a temporary need. The second point is that they do not require any kind of proofs of stability or willingness to stay to provide their service. And I think what is interesting also from an architectural point of view, there are 2 doors in this space and people can really enter and exit however they want, and there is no control in this sense. And I think this is also a sort of symbol of this free of movement inside spaces. And if we think of any other service like reception centers, maybe there is a free access, but never a free exit, like there is a control on it. And the last point is that this place is very, very flexible. All kind of people enter there. They can do all different kinds of activities. I saw people just staying there to wait for friends or meeting each other, asking for legal support. And the way the furniture is used, I can't show picture because during the pandemic was really hard to take pictures inside. I could only enter and draw, but I can ensure that the furniture was used in a very flexible way according to the different activities. And so I think this is also an example of how different profiles and uses can really be deployed when we think of a loose regulation of these spaces. And just to conclude, I wanted to share a reflection I had while finishing this presentation. I think that these kind of reflections that in my case probably are still very confused and ongoing are not only relevant. I mean, this relation between architecture and integration is not only relevant in the field of migration studies, but I think is also very urgent in the field of architecture and urban planning, because I think that when we observe migration processes processes and arrival processes, we're really raising questions, and as the one I raised, that are very challenging for these disciplines. And to a closer look, they do not only belong or involve migrant populations, but a wider range of populations that are temporary, mobile, and diverse, and that dwell our cities today. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Martina. It's really interesting to contrast your emphasis on temporariness with Fatin's emphasis on perhaps accidental permanence, or at least long-term stays. And one thing I'm wondering, you started out by talking about arrival or landing as the first step in integration. And maybe later on, you could just give us a few words on how you understand integration when it comes to people who are on the move, people who are flowing through. So I'll just leave that with you, and now ask Jishi if she'll take the microphone and give us her presentation.
Great, fascinating presentations. Thank you. I'm sharing my screen right now. Can you see it now?
Yes, just fine, thanks.
Okay, great. I'm going to press the play button. All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored to join this important conversation today. My presentation will focus on the Greater Toronto Area, specifically on the manifestation of diversity in suburban landscapes and the importance of inclusive planning in building welcoming communities from arrival cities. Diversity, our strength, is a widely used slogan. Also, it's Toronto's city model. We normally measure diversity with data. In North America, today's immigrants tend to bypass the traditional downtown core and settle directly into the suburbs. As you can see in this graph, suburban municipalities in the Greater Toronto Area represent hyperdiversity. In Toronto, 47% of the population are immigrants. The percentage is even higher in outer suburbs. In total, 56% of the immigrants in the Greater Toronto Area have settled in the suburban peripheries. However, diversity and inclusion is not just numbers. Despite the fact that multiculturalism and diversity is largely embedded in Canada's national identity, and the diversity discourse runs the risk of being used as a glamorized blanket statement to describe differences in communities without addressing systemic issues of equity. The growing diversity challenges urban governance, policies, and spatial organization that conventionally lacks supportive social, spatial, and physical infrastructure to build social cohesion among diverse community members. Multiculturalism is not only a political philosophy or policy, but also a lived reality. What has remained challenging, however, is how to best understand immigrants' integration processes and lived experiences in cities and neighborhoods, especially in the emerging immigrant suburbs. Conventional suburbs are intentionally designed to be homogeneous and at odds with diversity. The emerging ethnic landscapes are challenging the status quo. Diverse needs for housing, retailing, schools, places of worship, public spaces, leisure activities, community services are manifested in suburban landscapes. Immigrants are reshaping these spaces with new identities and new meanings, which have several implications for municipalities, including, for example, first, changing physical form, whether exotic design fits in with the neighborhood's character. Second, demographic change and social inclusion. Questions like who belongs to and in the neighborhood. And third, competing claims for community authorship. Whose voice, whose rights, and who gets to tell the story of the neighborhood. Based on my research in these immigrant suburbs, I made a 25-minute documentary based on to capture immigrants' placemaking practices that have reshaped the landscapes and communities in these suburbs. The documentary is entitled Suburbia, Suburban Placemaking Amidst Diversity. You can actually watch it on YouTube. Given the limited time, I'm only sharing the first 2-minute clip to give you a glimpse of the immigrant suburbs in the Toronto area. So I'm going to stop the sharing here and switch to the film viewing mode. I'm going to share my screen here. Just give me 1 sec. Share sound. Can you see the film? I'm going to...
They give you food first. If your stomach's full, then you can pray. Everybody welcome. That's why in the Golden Temple we have 4 doors: north, east, west, south. So that's where everybody can come welcome there.
This is Malton, a suburb of Toronto. Toronto is known around the world for its multiculturalism. The city motto even claims diversity is our strength. But what does diversity and multiculturalism really mean to cities? Is it more than exotic symbolism like parades, cultural dresses, food and restaurants? I want to understand how people interact with each other, how they share spaces and how they share knowledge and develop an appreciation of different cultures, what kind of challenges they are dealing with. Underneath the exotic places, behind that I want to know what's happening with the people on the street and how they have made this multicultural city their own.
I consider myself Canadian first, but definitely I'll never forget where my parents came from because they've instilled that in me.
怎么讲呢？就是说我们从亚洲来到这里是完全西方的社會，我們去適應這個環境，去 enjoy 這個環境，去感受這個環境的美。
係啊，有啲嚟嗰陣時咧，就梗係有啲少唔妥，真係唔係幾好。我覺得做完之後佢好翻咯喎，咁我話好啊，你同政府慳錢啊，你哋係嘛，每日做咗善事咯喎，嚇。
The Agincourt area has a lot of Chinese businesses, but it's not a Chinatown. It's everybody and his brother, and they're all there, and they all seem to be getting along well, and they all seem to be going about their business.
Okay, just going back to my slides. Just give me 1 sec. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, just fine, thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, the next few slides will discuss the key issues around immigrant suburbs and placemaking. Unlike conventional suburbs, many immigrant neighborhoods in my research have relatively high degrees of institutional completeness, which means immigrant communities have developed various sizes and scales of ethnic institutions, satisfying the needs of co-ethnic community members. Here's one example in the city of Brampton. Within 1 kilometer stretch, a 15-minute community has been fully developed in the last 30 years. It's comprised of 4 retail complexes, including over 400 South Asian, Caribbean, and African businesses. In addition to retailing, there are 3 Hindu temples, 1 Sikh Gurdwara, 1 Islamic service center, 1 community center, 1 private school, 2 massive banquet halls, 1 hotel, offering a large variety of services and community spaces for local residents who are mainly Black and South Asians. However, conflicts related to land use design, public engagement and infrastructure investment and development continue to arise, exposing plannings or municipalities' unreadiness to keep pace with the diverse needs of immigrant communities, who must continually negotiate their use of space and fight for their rights to their spaces. I'm going to use some examples to elaborate more. For example, there are always tensions between incompatible land uses. In this case study of the Great Punjab Business Center that was developed on an employment land, which means the stores can only be used for wholesaling. Retailing is not allowed to exceed 20% of the unit space. Since the location is next to a Gurdwara and a Sikh private school, many businesses have already provided cultural goods and services to the South Asian community. However, they had to hide their merchandise and claim that the store is used as a wholesaling facility when by law enforcement staff inspecting the area. The community had to appeal the zoning decision and face several prosecutions issued by the city. The controversy actually lasted for 10 years until the city decided to rezone the area and reflect commercial retail uses. In another case study, the area was already overzoned with retail spaces. The retail developer from the Sikh community actually worked closely with the community members, the local residents, to address their concerns because of the lack of worship and community space in the neighborhood. As a result, instead of building more retail units, they moved forward with the development of a Gurdwara on the retail site. In this case, the city was short-sighted as they did not have a good understanding of local community needs. Here's another example. Another criticism is about the rigid design guidelines that only reflect the conventional cultural values. The retail developer actually is developing a retail plaza right next to a 100-year-old church. The city said the windows must match the oval windows of that church. So the developer had to change the design into use the oval windows to reflect on the conventional design in order to get the approval. And here's another example that I showed the case study of the Great Punjab Business Center. In this case study, the city wanted the developer to provide more parking spaces because it's a retail plaza. However, a lot of people going to the area, they walk to the space and they see, because it's right next to a private school and a Gurdwara, right next to this retail plaza. And people tend to walk there and use the services and go to the places of worship. They actually prefer more community spaces. And the developer hired an architect who used these architectural motifs as well as the public arts to commemorate the Sikh culture and history and heritage in this retail space. The of immigrant communities in municipal policies and processes has become problematic. Such invisibility could further marginalize these communities whose voices easily get silenced or dismissed during formal institutionalized processes. The negotiation process could be frustrating for both immigrant communities and city staff. One of the issues is around insufficient investment in those areas facing physical challenges in need of improvement. As you can see in these strip malls, the typical suburban strip malls in Toronto, and actually behind the rundown strip malls is the very vibrant social and community life. And as a quote from the interviewee, I think this area has been vibrant and viable for so many years. It definitely gets missed. And people don't think we have such a concentration of ethnic stores and Caribbean stores and South Asian stores, and we should not be forgotten. The other case study in Scarborough and in the suburb of Toronto, the broken transit promises have deeply frustrated the local community for decades. As one business improvement area manager mentioned, the local community met with an individual who was a politician, a city councillor, a major player in the Toronto Transit Commission. And he asked where this area was. And we said it's between these roads. And he said, where is that? And that shocked me and said to me, wow. So that kind of ongoing issues actually indicate there's these areas, they are not considered as priority according to the city agenda. And also there's a lack of institutional support in official planning policies. Existing acknowledgements only highlight the economic benefits associated with immigration, for example, without explicit statements on developing a permissive policy environment to support ethnic communities' placemaking efforts and settlement needs. As the Mississauga strategic plan points out, widespread cultural diversity hasn't translated into a rich urban environment in architecture, services, or retail. Mississauga's diversity has the potential to express itself more prominently, to fundamentally change the experience of the city and leverage our identity as a mature urban center. To wrap up, and considering the limited time, and I'm offering a couple of major takeaways when it comes to planning with diversity. The first is for municipal policies. It must apply an equity lens to a range of immigrant settlement and integration matters, such as housing, education, employment, entrepreneurship, transportation, community services, and connect these matters to the broader community context, especially in the planning for the public realm, neighborhood change, heritage preservation, and community resilience. Second, revisit policies, engagement processes, programming, and service deliveries to ensure they are culturally sensitive and appropriate for diverse communities. Third, prioritize community engagement and collaboration to inform decision-making. Public consultation conducted as a minimum statutory requirement may do little to promote community ownership of plans, particularly when working with groups who face myriad barriers to engagement, including language, age, gender, or feelings of powerlessness. Fourth, a renewed and empowered community process should be adopted to ensure underrepresented groups have their own space to voice their concerns and engage in the co-creation of planning solutions and avoid tokenistic public consultation approaches. And last, a high degree of institutional completeness should be considered an asset of the suburban neighborhood. Municipalities should conduct asset mapping of the existing cultural facilities and reinvest in the established social infrastructure. The asset planning process should also involve considerations of shared spaces, shared uses, and shared services with the wider community, which will help transition from co-ethnic bonding to intercultural bridging. That concludes my presentation. And if you are interested in watching the film, you can basically just search Groburbia on YouTube and you will locate the film. And I hope you will enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, GC. Certainly I will be looking at your film. Thank you very much. Fascinating presentation. And you know, it goes back right to our first discussion with Faten, talking about power in relationship to architecture. And so you are looking at it from the point of view of a highly developed city, and you were showing that a lot of the newcomers to Toronto and to the suburbs of Toronto simply don't have the power to have much of a voice over the urban planning process and with regard to the architectural results. So my question for you, just for you to reflect on a little bit later, are you optimistic about multicultural urban planning being instituted in Canadian cities? And I think of this partly for selfish reasons. I live in Ottawa, where we do have emerging institutionally complete ethnic enclaves, and absolutely no recognition of this fact in contemporary Ottawa urban planning. So thank you for that. And now what I would like to do is just go back to our speakers and see if they have some reflections on the questions that I posed, and then I'll turn quickly, and I'll ask your responses to be very quick. Then I'll turn quickly to the questions that are showing up in the chat box. So Fatin, do you have any comments on the question that I raised to you a few minutes ago?
Thank you, Howard, and I would like to thank the co-speakers for the depth of their presentations. I was really captivated by both presentations, and it was also a learning opportunity for me to see the evolution of refugees' relation to space in a transitory situation and in a city where they're supposed to live permanently. And in the presentations, I can see that this relation between power and space is permanent, and it evolves, and it develops, being affected by the same factors. What is the level of power of refugees over their space? What is their institutional status? How is the government treating them? Are they free to choose their location? Are they free to choose the typology of their spaces? And strangely enough, these questions apply to the three stages of the immigration. 3, what is the level of restriction on their appropriation of space? In the case of refugees, they are, for example, in an informal settlement, they are restricted to use specific material that are considered to be temporary. Or what is the type of occupancy agreement? Is it legal? Is it illegal? Is it recognized by the municipality? And 5, what is, or to which extent are refugees empowered? And also in the case of Martina and of Jishi, what is the level of their empowerment? What is the level of their inclusion? How does the government and the hosting community perceive them and consider them? So all of these elements define the power of refugee over space and define their freedom to choose and to appropriate and to control the spaces in which they live. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Fatin. Martina, we actually have a question from our audience that relates, in fact, 2 questions that relate to my question to you about how you understand integration in the context of people who are on the move. And so here's a question. The notion of integration into the host was somehow avoided. What do we mean by that at all? In this regard, the match between the home / sending countries and the host countries is very vital. To what extent can the protection facilitation of clinging to the original identity, religion, and culture promote genuine integration? So a challenge for you, Martina.
I'll try my best. So first, I thank you all at this point for this question. I do believe that we should ask ourselves about integration already from arrival. And the big mistake we can do is to think that arrival is something temporary that doesn't last long, and so is not the right moment to sort of address this issue. Instead, we're seeing how, as a process, it's getting very long in certain cases. And so it's the right sort of phase where to ask ourselves about integration. And in this sense, for what I saw, I think that a lot has to do with the possibility to with the access to resources and with coexistence with difference, even if it's a lighter coexistence, even if it's just a sort of body exercise of being together in the space. But I think that, yeah, it's a question of letting this coexistence be, and on the other hand, an access to resources. And the example, for instance, when we talk about housing, we see that refugees and asylum seekers after receptions, even if they are still waiting for the documents and so on, they cannot access ordinary housing. There are very difficulties in the, for instance, in the private market and also in the public housing. And so I think that before even talking about integration, there is a question of how these people, even if they are on the move, can really access resources. And so I think the major challenge on the side of the city is a little bit to see how could we grant the access to resources also for people who live in this very open-ended condition. And if we think about this, is not really, I think it's always easier when we make a comparison with other kind of populations. For me as a Erasmus student and so on, again, I had many difficulties, which of course are very different from refugees and asylum seekers. But I think that is a huge question of cities today. So how to grant the access to resources also to people that are not traditional citizens, like permanent and stable in cities. And I think that integration, the very first thing when it comes to arrival, is really an equal access to resources and the possibility of coexisting even in different conditions.
Thank you. That helps. That makes sense. Jishi, we've got a couple of questions that are actually directed to you that to a certain extent relate to what I asked you to think about. So let me just read these out to you. In Jishi's documentary, I did not see the mixing of different kinds of people, but the clustering of the same sort. And then the next question. I noticed that all speakers have a rather uniform picture of immigrant ethnic communities. Apparently, assimilation of, in brackets, some newcomers does not occur. The same holds for class difference. The latter was especially noticeable in Jishi's presentation. So Jishi, do you have some comments that you could offer in response? And your microphone is still muted.
Yes, thank you, Susanna, for raising the question about, first the questions about the documentary. In the full documentary, there are some scenes about creating inclusive spaces, especially the public spaces that are designed for everybody, like say, for example, street festivals and the taste of different cultural foods on the street, etc. But I admit, definitely there's a limitation when I was doing the documentary production. It's hard to capture some of the spaces with people's consent, for example, to actually provide that visuals. But I do remember there's like comments from the participants about the comfort zone. Like when you are new to this country, to this city, and you tend to find your co-ethnic members, and then you basically prefer to stay in this comfort zone. So is it slowing down the integration process to the whole society? This is kind of an ongoing discussions among the participants themselves. Like in the documentary, I showed the group of Chinese seniors. They are doing the fan dance and daily exercise in the Chinese mall. But that could be really exclusive to other groups of people. But in some other cases, like places of worship, you only meet with your co-ethnic members in that specific space. But we do have other case studies, like other examples to show, like, for example, a heritage schoolhouse that has been adapted to different uses and being flexible. And for example, every day during the weekdays from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m., the heritage house, a schoolhouse, was actually used by a group of Sikh male seniors who do social activities, cooking or playing board games, or basically chit-chatting with each other from Monday to Friday, 12 to 4 p.m. Exclusively for this group of people. Then in the evening, it's a yoga program for anybody, and some other senior programs, kids extracurricular programs, or on the weekends, it's for another church group. So that heritage schoolhouse is being flexible, providing flexible spaces for different groups. and creating that shared space to promote intercultural exchange and communication. So that is super important to me when I talk about inclusive planning. We are not just planning for a specific group of people, but also we need to consider the differences and the diverse needs of different groups. So when we, especially that applies to the design of the public realm. And we talk about transit, streets, parks, and community centers and libraries, right? And the way that people identify these spaces could be super different. And how can we actually create those truly inclusive spaces? And the documentary was I was trying to capture different characters' experiences of those spaces and their contribution to placemaking through their businesses or through their professional or personal involvement in the community. So it's really hard to provide like a full picture of all these important discussions. And I do agree, you asked very important questions about how to create that inclusiveness, and in the public space. But there's a limitation to the documentary. But in my writing, in my publications, and I try to adjust that because it definitely associated with intercultural communication and bridging the different groups. Especially what we can do for planners is to invest in the public realm to provide those opportunities and share spaces.
Okay, thank you, Jishi, very much. We are pretty well out of time, but I do want to note that we do have other questions that we'll have to take up on another occasion, but I think it's worth noting the questions. We have one comment that's interesting and provocative, a quote from Banerjee. We demanded some genuine reforms, some changes. Some among us even demanded the end of racist capitalism, and instead we got multiculturalism. Interesting comment. And then we have a general question that I think is fascinating and really underlines a lot of what is going on in these conversations in the West about the relationship between preserving a national cultural heritage expressed through architecture and meeting the needs of newcomers. So we do have, there are other questions that I'm sorry, I'm just not going to run into. I don't have enough time to go through them because we are indeed out of time. I would like, however, to reiterate my sincere thanks to our three speakers. I think that today's session was really, really stimulating, highly professional. A lot of research is behind all three presentations. So my thanks to you, Faten, to you, Martina, to you, Jishi, for I think leading us on a terrific conversation that I hope will have spillover effects into the future. And thank you again to you, Jan, and to Metropolis for hosting this event. And I'll now turn it over to you for concluding remarks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And also the speakers, thank you very much for your presentations. I had a number of other questions myself, but I will send you them by email. There's a recording of this webinar, and the recording will be made available on YouTube and on the Metropolis website, but I will send everybody an email about the location. Right after the summer, there will be another session, another webinar on more or less the same topic. So we want to continue. And later in the fall, there will be several other webinars about different topics. But we got your email address, and those who have indicated that we may use it, we will share all new announcements with you, so you will be in the know. Thank you very much. Hubert, thank you for chairing the session. And with that being said, I see Faten waving their hands.
I just need 1 minute because I was sorry for interrupting Jan, but I just need to make three very, very short reflections on cities being spaces of flux. And
Keep it very short. You get 30 seconds.
Very short. I promise you. I promise you. Cities are spaces of flux and transformation. They cannot not be influenced by people who are coming and going, and one culture does not restrict or remove another one, and temporariness does not exist even in transitory spaces. It's enriching to have other people's influence. And my last idea is something that the philosopher Derrida said, and how he described the earth as a globe, and how can we divide it? It's a globe and it belongs to everyone. Thank you.
All right, and thank you very much. Hey, I wish everybody a great day. Bye-bye.